So again, I'd like to introduce Francesca Mangano, who's the CSR and Sustainability Executive for the TFG brands. And we've called it Starting the Journey because Francesca and TFG responded to that initial call to support the intervention on the seafarers in May, I think it was. And
June,
in June. And since June has really started this journey of mapping the supply chain and then working with ITF to understand that and to have bilateral talks. But Francesca, over to you.
Thanks, Bev. So, I mean, this is basically our very little experience of dealing with this issue. And I think that our dealings with Ruan and Liz really showed how little we knew about the issue. So when in June it was brought to our attention that human rights abuses were perpetrated in the shipping industry, we felt that we just couldn't ignore it. I mean, I couldn't comprehend the magnitude of the issue. And particularly what I couldn't comprehend it was that for years, we spent time and efforts mapping our supply chain upstreams and, going, from even down to tier 3, 4 and identifying risks of, human rights abuses there where, we could potentially apply intervention. In this particular case, we felt that this was a hidden part of our supply chain and operation, despite them moving, over 90% of the world's goods across the world. And, by looking at it, it was, there was no doubt that we were facing a humanitarian crisis. So the thought of, how much we rely on the shipping industry to allow for our goods to, be transported and for our global supply chains to function. And yet we failed to detect that this was an issue in our supply chains until, of course, we reached, really, really critical levels, obviously exacerbated by the pandemic. And when we heard back in June the presentation that Ruan made in the ETI webinar, and when I heard Ruan describing the suffering of these key workers that were sometimes stranded at sea for over 17 months when the Maritime Labour Convention says that the maximum limit is 11 months, away from their families and in the middle of the global pandemic, was so heartbreaking. And I came away from it thinking that, this was not only like a huge business risk, but it was, my duty as employed, by my organization to bring this issue to the board. So literally the day after, I had an urgent meeting with our UK board to describe what we were facing. I brought the facts to our chief financial officer in the UK, and the UK board brought the issue to our Australian and South African board. And also to exacerbate the difficulties at the time was that I had absolutely zero teams. We were in the middle of the pandemic with all of my team furloughed. I literally had no resource span to apply to this. So I didn't really know how to tackle the issue. My first instance was to contact our procurement director to try to understand, okay, what is the extent of this supply chain that I don't know anything about? So we started working with our logistics partners as a matter of business risk, essentially, because the only way that I could make my voice heard internally is if I brought it as a business risk. Suddenly there was this huge risk where supply chain deliveries were already delayed by the pandemic. Suddenly there was another, sidelined issue where, deliveries could potentially be cancelled by an imminent strike of seafarers because of this issue. And I think that was the knee-jerk reaction that I needed to have internally to actually spearhead the machine. And so we needed to gain more visibility. And by then, the procurement director put me in touch with our logistics partner, so that we could look at where the routes of all the shipping vessels were taking place between, essentially we started mapping from the 1st of January 2020 to the 1st of June, when we sort of like started finding out. And what came back was rather hard to untangle, because suddenly it was the first time I was seeing this data. I just couldn't understand the vocabulary behind it. And it dawned on me that this was too big a task at hand that I could solve on my own. So I went back to ETI and I asked if I could potentially have the support of the ITF and Rowan. And to be fair with you, I totally admit that this was a really scary move, because I was asking an external partner with whom I had no relationship with before this point, to look at this data where potentially, I could have been disclosing terrible doings, but I had to do it because I needed an expert advice on how to, essentially maneuver in this, unknown territory. So, and it was petrifying to wait and hear what was going to come back. So between the 1st of January and the 1st of June, we looked at all these data that literally represented about 52 vessels, of which 35 had ITF live agreements. Some of the vessels had expired agreements, and 8 of these vessels had no agreements at all. And this is really where the risk lied for us, because suddenly for these 8 vessels that, potentially were carrying a huge amount of people back and forth, not let alone the goods, we had no traceability of what was happening in those vessels. So just to give you an idea of what kind of data the ITF was looking at, when Ruan then presented the inspection data, that this inspection data found issues that were related to breach of ITF agreements that were either expired or revoked, breach of contract of employment, international standards of non-compliance, health and safety, medical issues, and owed wages. And in the specifics, some of the reports that came back highlighted that crew on board didn't receive any shore leave since March because of COVID-19. Some seafarers in isolation off the vessels had no medical covers. And some seafarers asked to terminate their agreement and ask for repatriation, but this was denied because of COVID-19. I mean, I had to bring this back to the board. And when the board looked at it, thought, okay, right, I mean, this is pretty serious, but what's next? What are we going to do about it? Because we have no leverage, we have no direct contact with these people. I mean, if these issues came out of an audit, a standard audit that we churn, day in, day out, first thing I would do is I'd pick up the phone to the suppliers and ask for a clarification. But in this particular instance, I had no idea what to do. So I set up a call with our procurement director because I wanted him to hear firsthand from Liz and from Ruan what exactly the issue is. Okay, you're hearing from me, but perhaps I'm not translating this correctly. And also because I wanted to understand, okay, what steps can we take here to instruct perhaps our supply chain partners, our logistics partners, and freight partners on best practice? Is there a best practice? So we then went, following our learnings from this call, we went back to our logistics partners because we wanted them to cascade the maritime protocol to our freight operators via our partners directly. I was thankful that both Liz and Rowan shared some sort of like templates where we could sort of convey our request to them. One other thing that actually was quite sobering was when in September I joined the UN Global Compact event on maritime crew changes, and I heard the testimony of Captain Hedi Marzougi firsthand. I mean, that really brought it home, and I realized the scales of this issue and how we more than ever have to look at solutions to really collaborate together and particularly really identify these risks in the downstream supply chains that most of us don't have absolute any visibility of. So I'm very thankful to Bev and ETI for allowing me to utilize this platform, because I don't know how many of the brands at ETI have responded to the webinar back in June, but I would like to use this platform to say that, first of all, this is an issue that affects all categories at ETI, whether it is A&T, whether there is the food industry, whether other sector in merchandise, etc. So we need to come together and work a framework in which this framework that sets guidelines for due diligence, accountability, and remediation, because I'm stuck at this point where I have issues in my sea freight supply chain, but I don't know how to resolve this. So we don't have a global framework agreement with trade unions. So, I mean, my leverage and my desire to actually resolve these issues is very limited. And at the same time, I would like to welcome the ETI to support its members with this in perhaps trying to get us together and discuss this. And we need also support in implementing a seafarers policy to include the Maritime Labour Convention. And we need support in linking up with partners such as the ITF to assess and verify inspections and access whistleblowing channels and access remedies. And I mean, this is just the beginning. Of course, then I had to go back and educate myself on the trackers issue, which is a completely yet another avenue of our logistics supply chain that is totally unknown. And when I went and read about it, I mean, it's what my question is, if we are so prompt at resolving issues in our upstream supply chains, how come are we not doing anything about this issue that essentially allows us to profit from, the goods that we sell? Without these key workers, we won't be able to have the products on the shelves. So it's, if at all, if we were to only do it from a business perspective, that, would make sense. But this is a true humanitarian crisis, equivalent to what's happening to the Uyghur in China. There is no difference. We're talking about people that are stranded at sea with no voice at all. So yeah, I mean, I would welcome opportunities to collaborate with other brands and for ETI to coordinate this.
Francesca, I almost feel we should pause for thought because I think from both, what we've heard so far from Ruwan and Liz, mapping it out and the scale, hearing from Glenn, that real sort of call to action, and again from yourself, I think you have really painted a picture for us where there is a necessity, but equally about taking that first step and what that looked like. And I just appreciate your honesty in that sort of initial, and then just mapping it out as to what you have done and how you've gone about it. And I just want to thank you and Glenn for sharing with us so articulately and passionately today.